My name is Rob Bernard. I am a director of artificial intelligence in PwC Labs at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I'm going to be talking to you today about responsible and ethical governance of AI models. Now, a lot of times, this is a quote from the New York Times from last year, about a year ago. A lot of times people are talking about bias. I'm going to read the quote. In series of equalizing performance across groups, they're not thinking about the underlying foundation, whether a task should exist in the first place, who creates it, who will deploy it, on which population, who owns the data, and how it's used. Obviously, these are important questions, especially in terms of fairness, equity, bias, and the ethics behind it, and regulation, whether it is the regulation of your own companies or the ethical principles of your own culture, whatever it might be. All these questions are very important in the implementation of any kind of AI, machine learning type model. Again, New York Times, Dr. Timnit Gebru from Dealing with Bias in Artificial Intelligence. So in this particular talk, I'm going to be referring to 4 different sections. First is talking about the need for responsible AI, talk about ethics and regulation, governance models, and then I'm going to end with a few thoughts on deploying models itself. And what I want to concentrate on here is the fact that ethics and governance are really 2 sides of a coin where there's a big middle in the coin, and we'll talk about that in a second. First, we'll talk about the need for responsible AI. It's big. The market itself is now approximately 13% of $2.6 billion in consulting services. This is a PwC commissioned study from last year. And it's only growing. In a couple of years, it's projected to be up to 17% of the market. These are important and obviously large services in the AI market. But it's relatively new in terms of the services themselves. This topic has obviously become very hot in the last couple of years, and I know on the agenda for this particular conference, there are a couple of people talking about responsible and ethical AI. And really within the whole AI, there are really 6 areas of risks that come about with responsible AI. There are application level risks, and there are business and national level risks. So the society, market, regulatory forces are really take a new approach. So maybe it's performance risk of the model itself, whether the model is biased, whether it has errors, whether it's opaque. There's also the security risk. Is it the model subject to adversarial attacks? Is someone's trying to actively fool or trick the model into predicting or suggesting something that isn't either right or ethical or dangerous, in fact. Could be cyber attacks as well. And of course, even though many companies advocate and I think use open source software, virtually every company uses it to some degree, there are of course always risks with open source software as well. The crowdsourcing may mitigate the risks somewhat, but there are definitely risks with that. There's also governance risk. I mean, without human agency, AI models really can run wild. They can go rogue, and they can have unintended consequences. If you just let the model do what the model says, if you're given a new set of data that doesn't work out as well, the model may go rogue and do something it's not supposed to. In addition, the other risks we talk about ethical risks. There may be lack of values themselves. There may be a value misalignment. Your values may not mesh with your company's values or your society's values or country's regulations. Economic risk. People are afraid of getting their jobs displaced by AI and automation, of course. And societal risk, autonomous weapons are the big one. Do we really want an AI pulling the trigger? And surveillance issues with age of surveillance. Do we really, is this something that we as a society tolerate, or is it something that we reject? Or is there some middle ground there? So within our review of it, there are really 5 dimensions of responsible AI. On one hand, there is the ethics and the regulation. On the other side are the governance issues. And in between are really the performance and security issues: bias, fairness, interpretability. Can you understand what the model's doing? Explainability. Can you explain what the model's doing? And robustness, security. Is the model vulnerable to attacks? And privacy. And the ethics on one side and the governance on the other side really are not just links in a chain. They're not just paths along the way. They really expand the entire gamut of the performance and security risks, and for performance and security dimensions. Ethics and governance have to do with whether bias and fairness and the security and the interpretability and the explainability. They across the entire spectrum of those performance and security, ethics and governance actually apply. So I'm going to talk first about the ethics part of it. And really, the ethics part, there are really 3 main questions that we believe that you really should consider when you are in the middle of implementing or developing an AI model. Are your algorithms making decisions in a way that align with your values? Is it a value-based model itself? Or is your algorithms just making decisions that don't align with your values? An important question. Second, do your customers trust you with the data? Are you able to take a customer's data and use it responsibly? Are you exploiting it? Obviously, data models, data agreements are extraordinarily important to maintain a sense of responsibility and a responsible use of data and responsible AI models based on that data. But are those, from an ethical standpoint, is that something you really want to exploit data? There's obviously been many cases in the last few years of companies going and exploiting data and using it for purposes that it wasn't really intended. In addition, there's a regulation here too. Obviously, general GPDR in Europe, general data regulation in Europe is something that is regulatory and having to do with data usage itself. So you may codify the ethics in a regulation depending on your culture. And how is your brand affected if you can't explain how AI systems work? So someone comes to you, you run an AI model, it denies a loan, for instance, to a particular person. If you don't know why it designed a loan, or the model cannot explain itself, how it works, or in essence, why it denied a particular loan, it's potential reputational risk for the company itself. So another question to consider is, do you really want to take on that reputational risk? And how is would your brand be affected if this explainability is not possible? So the European Commission high-level expert group on AI, in a document called the Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI, came up 3 principles fairness, explicability or transparency, and prevention of harm. And I'll talk a little bit about each one of these. In the principles of fairness, I'm not going to read this entire thing, but I just want to point out a couple key phrases of it. There are many different interpretations of fairness. Is fairness good to me? Is fairness good to you? Is it to our society, to our company, to lower income, to a minority status, to a particular legal status, whatever it might be? There are different definitions of fairness depending on where you're coming from. So in this particular principle, the European Commission for the high-level expert group on AI talked about the AI system should never lead people to being deceived or unjustifiably impaired in their freedom of choice and what they want to do. So you want to be able to give people freedom of choice. You want to treat people equitably. You want to treat people fairly. And it's, again, there's a broad definition. So important principle of fairness, first ethical principle. And again, here it is. There is definitions of fairness. What definition are we going to use? bias detection, also very important in the sense here that how do we detect bias given the different data sets that we have, protected attributes in the data sets, different decisions that you make? That prevention of bias and able to discover that bias is crucially important in order to, the next step, mitigate that bias or intervene for that bias itself. How do we change the thresholds on decision variables to be less discriminatory? How do we trade off accuracy and fairness? Maybe if our model, and in fact, some of you probably realize that your model can be less biased, but it might be more unfair or less predictive. So you're really trading off that bias and accuracy. In many cases, you're trading off that bias and accuracy trade-off. So those are a particular principle of fairness. The next principle is the principle of explicability, or open, transparent, to operate transparently. We want to make sure that you really have transparency in understanding how the model was built, what the model is doing, why the model is doing what it is. It should be auditable. You should be able to produce models that may look black boxy in terms of its algorithms underneath it, but in essence, you can dissect it. It can be comprehensible by human beings themselves, rather than just having some sort of purely unexplainable answers. So again, if you have a deep learning model, this may be very difficult to do in terms of the abstract, but able to come up with a reasonable explanation, a testable explanation of why it works is also important. Also, you want to be able to give people consent that they're being used or they are using AI systems as well. And that explicability is a precondition for informing those consent. So really, we're going to talk about a few things here. Transparency, understanding the model's decision-making, explainability, understanding the reasoning behind each decision, and provability, the mathematical certainty. So the global interpretability is one thing that's important. How does the model do what it does? That kind of interpretability itself. And then there's something called local explainability, which is, why did the model make a particular decision? Why was my loan denied? Why did I predict not to make that decision? Those particular individual decisions is that local explainability. And finally, provability is required, it says, only in the most sensitive of applications to prove that it can actually, the mathematical certainty behind those decisions. The two things really the key here is the local and global explainability. How does the model work, and why did it make a particular decision? And again, the third principle here is the prevention of harm. AI systems should neither cause nor exacerbate harm, otherwise adversely affect human beings. Safe, security, robust, and private as well. So the four pillars of prevention of harm are listed here. Robustness, it is unlikely to break or fail, and it's reliable and consistent in its outcome. Safety is, it is actually, physical safety is important here. Robots in factories, for instance, important that they are physically safe to the humans they're working alongside of. Security itself, is it prevented against malicious attacks? Is it virus proof or virus safe, as much as it were? And then privacy itself, does it protect the person's data? Privacy, personally identifiable information. Those are prevention of harm to the people itself. All of these principles themselves are ethical principles. And this is one of the things, again, at all parts of a modeling process, from the development, from the strategic understanding, all the way to deployment, these ethical principles of fairness, explicability, prevention of harm must be maintained, and one could be vigilant of these particular principles during the development, deployment, and maintenance of a model itself. So moving on a little bit here, I'm going to skip this for a second. We'll talk a little bit about governance models themselves. So governance is the other side of the coin. So we started with ethics, and now we're moving to governance. And governance is the ability to accountability for all parts of the system, being able to have people check off what has happened, people to check in to how a model is progressing, legal, technical, administrative, management sign off and understanding of the process of the model itself. And really, we want to get into some important questions when we're designing a new governance structure. What questions should we ask before we design these governance structure? What levels of governance are desired or are needed? And then the final question is, how do we practically implement these structures themselves? So how do we design it? What do we need to put in there? And then how do we implement it themselves? And we really want here, as it's a risk minimization exercise here. We want to assess and minimize the risk. And obviously, depending on what industry you're in, the amount of risk you're able to, or you desire, or your company's strategic priorities say you should take on particular issues. And it may be different for different for different operations within a company itself. It may be monolithic for a particular company. The risk is really up to the company itself. There is no, in a governance structure, there is no one size fits all solution. But what you do need to consider these, again, is the questions that you need to come up with as you're designing it. What levels and procedures do you need to put into place? And finally, how do you going to implement such structures? Here's an example of designing the governance needed. We need several questions. So enterprise level, management level, model level, and data level. What questions do we need? For enterprise level, who's ultimately responsible? What oversight is required? How does intervention happen at the enterprise level? At the management level of a governance model, who is the authority to make these decisions? How are these decisions, what decisions are made? What reports are generated? And finally, how does feedback occur itself? Finally, for modeling, who do you need to explain the model to? And how the model's decision is explained. How is model testing performed? One question that's not in here, how is a model assessed as being good enough? What's your stopping criteria when you are designing a model? Do you want to minimize the false positives, minimize the false negatives, or have the lowest F1 score, whatever it might be? That's a question that needs to be decided like up front before you're deciding the model, not at the end of the whole process itself. And finally, how does the model's ROI get measured? If it's models that prevent things to happen, I do want to prevent something from happening. It's hard to measure a non-event. So how do you measure the ROI on models that are designed to prevent things? And maybe it's you compare fewer accidents this year than last year, and our model did that. Sure, that's one way of doing that. But what if you're trying to prevent low frequency events that rarely ever happen? Would the event have not have happened anyway? Those kinds of ROI are very difficult. In fact, the whole papers on these things deserve to be written on measuring ROI for measuring low frequency events in models. And finally, for data, who has access to the data? What purposes can it be used for? Can you use a secondary use of data after you have it? Is that in what your client agreement is? And finally, how long can data be retained? Does it have to be destroyed after a year? Whatever it might be. All important questions that again, one size fits all, but when you're designing a governance structure, something you need to think about. Excuse me. Responsible AI is just not a point in time. And I've tried to make this point that the ethics and the governance are part of the whole event itself. And if you look here, we have strategy at the top, corporate strategy, industrial standards and regulations, internal policies and practices. That's how it starts. It's a path that goes from the upper left down to the bottom. And strategy through planning, through managing the portfolio management, delivery approach, to oversight of the program itself. through the ecosystem. What's a technology roadmap? Where are we going to be years from now, a few years from now in the technology? Is our governance structure still going to be relevant if our technology is changing? Obviously important, and I'm sure you all realize, is change management. What are we going to allow to be changed in the model itself, in the technology, in the governance structure? Is there change management for this governance structure? And then we have a 9-step model that talks about, that is listed in the middle there, that I'll talk a little bit more beginning, but then this is the model development process. From business and data understanding, what is the problem that you're trying to solve up front? All the way through, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, evaluation and check-in after the model's over, maintenance of it, checking in, evaluating it, checking in after the model's been deployed. Is it still working? Does the new data we have fundamentally change the parameters of the model itself? Who is responsible for maintaining that, and who's responsible for actually doing that kind of maintenance? And finally, that's the audit and compliance and operational support at the end itself. So here's a brief thing on our 9-step process. And I basically talked about this. You scope the value at the beginning, business and data understanding, solution design. You prepare the data through pre-processing. You extract it from wherever you need. You build the model and you deploy it. Obviously, that's a big step. And that's where a lot of, obviously a lot of work goes in the data prep and the model building. But again, it's just one piece of the puzzle. That's not just where the governance and the ethically based governance goes. And finally, value delivery on the end, the monitoring, the check-in at the end, and working it into the workflows of your businesses itself. How is it going to integrate into the current methods and procedures that you have going? So we look at a traditional model governance, have 3 lines of defense. First line of defense, we're going to call the creators and the executors. Those are people who are building and developing, coding the models, operate them, and they are really vigilant through the entire model lifecycle itself. The second line of defense are the managers, directors, who assess the risks on the model itself, and those who are responsible for creating the strategy around the model. And finally, the auditors at the end, the people who are overseeing the other 2 to ensure compliance, to make sure that it fits with a larger policy, laws, strategy of the company itself, and the larger ecosystem around it, to make sure that the model itself and how it's being deployed and how it's being used, and it complies with not only the laws, but also the ethics and the strategy of the company itself. And excuse me, to that end, any model governance structure really needs to be validated and reviewed. All models need to be validated and reviewed using these 3 lines of governance right here: the creators and executors, the managers and directors, and the auditors themselves. So for instance, at the beginning, we have some source of the model, whether it's maybe citizen developers, if it's a democratization case where your employees can develop models themselves. Maybe it's a third-party tool. Maybe it's a custom-built model. And the data it comes from, whether it complies with privacy, that's the first step. And then we will go to the project team. So what are they responsible for in terms of the governance structures? They're responsible for model development and data use. They must follow the guidelines that they've gotten, whether they have to fill out any particular paperwork or any sort of bureaucratic thing. Maybe it's very simple bureaucracy. Maybe it's depending on the risk of the model itself, it could be very detailed and very careful to make sure that all the T's are crossed and I's are checked, I's are dotted. And it really needs to comply with the organization's strategy itself. Again, risk assessment, also a very important part of this. Not only in terms of how the model is being built, but downstream government requirements, and in essence, how is it going to affect our brand, our reputation, and most importantly, our client's brand, reputation, and our relationship with the client itself. What you do not want to happen is to have a model be developed and be developed poorly, give it to the client, and they completely, obviously, bombs on the client's side, and nothing, and you've ruined your reputational risk and for all models to come. So finally, process documentation, not an exciting topic to a lot of people, but you really need to be able to, the project team, the creators and the developers of the model need to be able to document things as they go along. Second line of defense in this is leadership and review. The managers and directors, they need to lay out the standards and specifications at the beginning of any model, including the acceptance criteria. And again, this may be strategic. As I said, are we going to minimize the false positive or negatives or F1 score, whatever it might be? They also have to take a very independent review. It's very difficult. It would be great if you have the resources to have this manager and director team be outside of the business unit that the developers are in. So they really do take an independent review as time goes on. People within their own organization reviewing their own models can possibly tend to take some shortcuts along the way. It's something you definitely don't want in a governance structure. And finally, there needs to be a SME, SMS, final approval of a model sign off, so that someone is ultimately responsible for the model itself, whether it, again, bias, fairness, explainability, interpretability, and security. And finally, the internal audit really goes through and says, all right, is our governance structure right? Are we complying to what we need to in terms of laws and regulations, in terms of the external environment? That's the audits themselves. Other possible groups that are involved in the model governance structure is an ethics board, whether it's at a company, whether it's an external ethics board, whether it's in a professional organization that you have to get your model or whatever your project approved by an ethics board along the way. And then finally, and really importantly, is ongoing monitoring. As the model is out in the field, if the data changes, do we need to go back and change the model? Do we need to recalibrate it? Do we need to retrain it? Is this model valid anymore? With COVID going on here, obviously a lot of models are going to need to be vast retraining, or do they ignore COVID? This is a modeling question that data scientists are going to have to contend with over the next few years. Is this period of time since March in the US, how are models going to deal with this very low frequency event, this almost anomalous event? Finally, I want to give in the last couple minutes here some thoughts on deployment itself of the model. When you're deploying a model, it seems almost trite, but really, if it's an ethically based governance model, you really have to ask yourself before you release it some questions. Who is ultimately going to be impacted by this, by the positive decisions, the negative decisions? What data am I using? Who does it represent? Am I using the data properly? Does this model shift power? This goes back to the beginning in the fairness. Is this a shift of power in terms of whether it's a financial power or political power, military power? Does it really, the model, how does a model shift power? And if it does, is that acceptable? Is that compliant? Can the model be contested by people who've been adversely affected by it? Is it contestable? And if it does get contested, are you able to defend it? Another important question. An existential question: should the model exist at all? Do I really need this model? If you're building the models, it's very likely you do need it because you're trying to make something more efficient, but that's a very important question. Does it enable better decision making? And finally, have I tested it under many different conditions? Obviously, if you're a data scientist, you run a validation set, excuse me, a training set, validation set, test set. But it really, have I considered other external factors and external conditions surrounding which I should run the model itself? Again, this goes to these low frequency events like COVID. How is that going to change it? Have I tested this under this condition? Is the model even valid under one of these events?